Victoria Sterling's shriek ripped through the hushed elegance of Le Jardin like a jagged lightning bolt. 200 pairs of eyes, previously focused on foie gras and flirtations, swiveled towards the VIP table. There, the millionaire's wife stood, a gilded statue of outrage, commanding attention with the regal air of a queen issuing a decree. Her diamond bracelet, a constellation of wealth, glittered as she pointed a manicured finger at the lone black waitress standing before her. A David facing down a Goliath in a designer dress. "Kneel down," she spat, the words dripping with venom. "Apologize for ruining my $20,000 Chanel dress." Imani rose, barely out of her 20s, remained motionless, her face a mask of carefully controlled composure. Her fingers, though, betrayed her, clutching a pristine white cloth napkin that trembled almost imperceptibly in her grasp. A constellation of spilled red wine, like drops of fresh blood, stained the pristine marble floor, stark evidence of the performance Victoria had so meticulously staged. The entire restaurant, from the busboys in the back to the socialites in the front, seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a tableau of anticipation, waiting to see if the young woman would crack under the immense pressure. "No." Imani's voice, though soft, sliced through the suffocating silence like a shard of ice. Victoria Sterling, blinded by privilege and entitlement, had no idea she'd just awakened a sleeping giant. The air itself seemed to vibrate, thick with unspoken tension, like a held note on a violin string about to snap. Victoria's face, usually a flawless canvas of expensive creams and perfectly applied makeup, flushed a dangerous crimson. No amount of cosmetic artistry could conceal the raw, unadulterated rage that simmered beneath the surface. She took a menacing step closer to Imani, her custom-made Louis Vuitton heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to impending war. "Excuse me?" Victoria's voice dropped to a dangerous, silken whisper, yet somehow, impossibly, it carried to every corner of the hushed dining room. "Did you just tell me no?" The faux spill, a pathetic attempt at victimhood, had served its initial purpose. Now came the real performance, the true spectacle. The other diners, those vultures in velvet and silk, maintained their pretense of polite dining, but a palpable anticipation crackled through the air, a tangible electricity that presaged an imminent lightning strike. This was dinner theater at its most depraved, a modern-day coliseum where the privileged elite watched with morbid fascination as a young woman was about to be torn apart. "I said no, Mrs. Sterling." Imani's voice, surprisingly steady, belied the frantic hammering of her heart against her ribs. She had witnessed the deliberate choreography moments before the staged accident, the theatrical gasp of outrage, the perfectly timed explosion of fury. None of it had been genuine, except for the cold, calculating malice that fueled it. "I will not kneel down and apologize for something I didn't do." Victoria's mouth fell open in genuine shock, a grotesque parody of surprise. It was as if no one, in all her years of pampered existence, had ever dared to contradict her, to deviate from the script she'd so carefully written. In her insulated world of private jets and exclusive country clubs, defiance was as foreign and unwelcome as poverty itself. The millionaire's wife blinked rapidly, her mind, accustomed to instant obedience, struggling to recalibrate, to devise a new attack strategy. "How dare you?" Victoria's shriek, even louder and more shrill than before, made the crystal chandeliers overhead tremble precariously. "Do you know who I am? My husband owns half this city." She whirled around, desperate for backup, for confirmation of her unquestioned authority. She found it in the form of David Thompson, the obsequious restaurant manager, who came scurrying over like a well-trained lapdog, eager to please his master. Thompson was a thin, nervous man, with a permanent sheen of perspiration on his forehead. He had spent years perfecting the art of currying favor with wealthy patrons, while simultaneously stepping on the necks of those beneath him. His darting eyes flickered between Victoria and Imani, calculating which side would offer the greater benefit to his pathetic career. The answer, of course, was painfully obvious. "Mrs. Sterling, I am so terribly sorry about this incident," he stammered, wringing his hands like they were prayer beads, seeking divine intervention. Thompson turned to Imani, his face contorted with barely concealed disgust. "Rose, what have you done now?" The question was dripping with loaded assumptions, that she was inherently guilty, that this wasn't her first offense, that someone like her was naturally prone to causing trouble. Imani had worked at Le Jardin for 8 grueling months without a single complaint, earning more in tips than servers with twice her experience through sheer professionalism and an unwavering work ethic. But none of that mattered, none of her hard work counted, when faced with Victoria Sterling's word, backed by the considerable weight of her husband's fortune. "I suggest you apologize immediately," Thompson continued, his voice now dripping with false authority. "Mrs. Sterling is one of our most valued customers. His loyalty had a price tag, and Victoria had already paid it in full." "I won't apologize for something I didn't do," Imani repeated, her voice surprisingly strong, growing stronger with each word, fueled by a righteous indignation. Her mother's mounting hospital bills were a crushing weight on her shoulders, threatening to drown her in debt. But her dignity was priceless, an unshakable foundation she refused to compromise. The medical debt climbed relentlessly towards $30,000, a suffocating avalanche of numbers, while machines beeped out the relentless rhythm of borrowed time in the sterile hospital room. Even desperation, she realized, had its limits. This job was her lifeline, the only thing keeping her afloat in a sea of financial ruin. Yet some prices, she knew instinctively, were simply too high to pay. "If you fire me for telling the truth, then so be it." The words, once spoken, tasted like a strange mixture of freedom and terror in equal measure. She was walking a tightrope high above an abyss of financial ruin, but she would walk it with her spine straight, her head held high. Victoria's initial fury slowly melted away, replaced by a cruel, almost predatory delight. This was even better than she had initially hoped for. Not just abject submission, but complete, utter destruction. "Fire her," she commanded, her voice a sound like breaking glass, sharp and brittle. "Oh no, firing is far too good for someone like her. I want her to understand her place in this world." She began to circle Imani, like a shark circling its prey, her voice carrying to every corner of the restaurant with practiced projection, honed over years of commanding attention at charity galas and social gatherings. "You people need to learn respect," she continued, her words dripping with venomous condescension. "You need to understand that there are consequences for stepping out of line." The coded language, the veiled insults, weren't lost on anyone present. Every server, every busboy, every person of color in the room understood the subtext, the unspoken threat hanging in the air. Phones, those ubiquitous tools of modern documentation, emerged from purses and pockets, capturing every agonizing moment for social media posterity. The weight of being watched, judged, dissected, pressed down on Imani's shoulders like a physical force, threatening to crush her. She could already see herself tomorrow, a viral video sensation, the uppity waitress who forgot her station, the one who dared to defy the established order. The comments would be vicious, the judgment swift and merciless, her reputation forever tarnished. But something deep inside her, a stubborn ember of defiance, refused to be extinguished, refused to break. Perhaps it was her mother's voice, weak but resolute, reminding her that dignity couldn't be bought or sold, that self-respect was the only currency that truly mattered. Perhaps it was the ghost of her grandfather, a sharecropper who had faced down far worse than Victoria Sterling and lived to tell about it, his spirit whispering in her ear, urging her to stand firm. "My place," Imani said quietly, her voice cutting through the restaurant's charged atmosphere, a small but defiant flame in the face of overwhelming darkness, "is not on my knees." Victoria's face contorted with unadulterated fury, a grotesque mask of privilege betrayed. "Your place is wherever I say it is. I know the mayor, the police chief, the head of every major business in this city. One phone call from me, and you'll never work in this town again." She snapped her perfectly manicured fingers for emphasis, the sound as sharp and cruel as a whip crack. The threat, delivered with such casual arrogance, hung in the air like poison gas, seeping into every corner of the room, suffocating hope and amplifying fear. Other servers, those silent witnesses to the unfolding drama, stopped what they were doing, their faces pale with vicarious fear, their eyes filled with a desperate plea for the whole thing to stop. They had all heard stories, whispered in hushed tones in the employee break room, of powerful people crushing those who dared to oppose them, of lives ruined and careers destroyed with a casual flick of the wrist. It was the unspoken rule of the service industry, the cardinal sin that could cost you everything. Keep your head down, smile, and never, ever fight back. Thompson, smelling blood in the water, seized the moment, sensing which way the wind was blowing with the ingrained instincts of a career survivor. Rose, you're suspended immediately. Clean out your locker and leave the premises. His voice, laced with a subtle undercurrent of glee, carried the unmistakable satisfaction of a man who had chosen the winning side and knew it. Security will escort you out. Two burly security guards, seemingly summoned by magic, materialized from the shadows, their imposing presence designed to add a final layer of humiliation to Imani's inevitable defeat. The other staff members, consumed by their own fear and self-preservation, averted their eyes, ashamed of their own cowardice, but unwilling to risk their own jobs for a lost cause. Solidarity was a luxury they couldn't afford in a world where rent came due every month regardless of principles, where survival depended on blind obedience. Victoria smiled triumphantly, already savoring her victory, already planning how she would embellish the story, transforming it into an amusing anecdote, a cautionary tale about knowing one's place in the natural order, to be recounted at her next charity luncheon. The defeated waitress would become a nameless, faceless pawn in her endless game of social dominance. As the security guards approached, their presence a looming threat, Imani clutched the white napkin tighter in her fist, her knuckles white with the strain. Hidden within its folds, concealed from prying eyes, was a small, embroidered reminder of who she truly was, a secret weapon waiting for the opportune moment to be revealed. She looked directly into Victoria Sterling's cold, predatory blue eyes and saw something the millionaire's wife, blinded by her own arrogance, had missed completely. Not defeat, but calculation. Not submission, but strategy. This isn't over, Imani said quietly, her words carrying a subtle but unmistakable promise. A silent vow that made Victoria's triumphant smile falter for just a heartbeat. The guards flanked her, their hands hovering protectively near their weapons, as she walked towards the exit. Her head held high, her back ramrod straight, despite the whispers and stares that followed in her wake like a malevolent shadow. Behind her, she left a room full of people who thought they had just witnessed a complete and utter destruction. They had no idea they had actually watched the first move in a complex and dangerous game. A game Victoria Sterling didn't even realize she had entered. The evening rain drummed a melancholic rhythm against the windows of Imani's modest apartment as she sat across from her mother at their small, worn kitchen table. Dorothy Rose looked heartbreakingly fragile in her faded pink robe, the relentless chemotherapy having stolen 30 pounds from her once robust frame, leaving her gaunt and weak. But her eyes, those windows to her indomitable soul, still held the unwavering fire that had fueled her unwavering determination to raise her daughter to never back down from bullies, to never compromise her principles. "Tell me what happened, baby," Dorothy said, her voice raspy but filled with love, reaching across the table to squeeze Imani's hand with fingers that felt like bird bones wrapped in fragile tissue paper. Imani recounted the evening's events, carefully choosing her words, watching her mother's expression subtly shift from initial concern to quiet pride to an underlying, simmering fury. "That woman thinks she can break you because of the color of your skin and the uniform you wear," Dorothy said finally, her voice low but filled with a quiet intensity. "She doesn't know who she's dealing with. Does she?" A faint smile, hinting at untold secrets and unyielding strength, crossed her weathered face. A smile that only a mother who had sacrificed everything for her child's education, who had poured every ounce of her being into nurturing her daughter's dreams, could possess. "No, Mama, she doesn't." Imani pulled out her laptop, the same battered machine that had carried her through 2 grueling years at Harvard Business School, before the harsh realities of financial constraints had forced her to abandon her studies and take on a series of service jobs to keep her family afloat. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the practiced muscle memory of someone who had once commanded complex spreadsheets and intricate financial models, not carrying plates and taking orders. Victoria Sterling thinks she knows everything about everyone, but she's about to learn that assumptions can be incredibly dangerous. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow across the room, as search engines began to reveal their secrets, unlocking a treasure trove of information. Society pages, charity event photos, business registrations, property records, every digital breadcrumb that the Sterling family had carelessly left in their wake of wealth and privilege was about to be meticulously examined under a digital microscope. Information, she knew, was power, and Imani Rose had spent years learning how to weaponize data, how to transform seemingly innocuous details into potent instruments of justice. The first hour of research painted a predictable picture of typical old money excess. Exclusive country club memberships, lavish political donations, and enough extravagant charity galas to fund a small nation's entire healthcare system. But as Imani dug deeper, sifting through the mountains of superficial information, subtle cracks began to appear in the Sterling Empire's seemingly pristine facade. Richard Sterling's construction company, Sterling Enterprises, had been flagged by city regulators no less than 3 times in the past year for blatant permit violations, skirting regulations and cutting corners to maximize profits. There were also hushed whispers circulating on anonymous business forums about delayed payments to subcontractors, leaving smaller businesses struggling to stay afloat. 2 civil suits, alleging breach of contract and shady business practices, had also been quietly settled out of court, with non-disclosure agreements preventing the victims from speaking out. Interesting, Imani murmured, her eyes gleaming with newfound determination, meticulously copying links and building a comprehensive digital file that would have impressed even her most demanding professors at Harvard. The pattern, she realized, was subtle but unmistakable, a carefully concealed web of deceit and financial manipulation. A company bleeding money, teetering on the brink of collapse, while desperately maintaining the outward appearance of prosperity and success. Classic signs of financial distress, she thought, expertly concealed beneath layers of designer clothing and extravagant displays of wealth. Her phone buzzed insistently, signaling an incoming text message from Jessica Martinez, her former study partner from Harvard, a brilliant and ambitious woman who now worked as a senior auditor at Peterson Blake & Associates, one of the most prestigious accounting firms in the country. "Girl, I saw the video from tonight," the message read. "Are you okay?" Jessica's message was followed by 3 flame emojis and a direct link to a trending social media post where the confrontation at Le Jardin was already being dissected and debated by a chorus of anonymous strangers, each eager to offer their own unsolicited opinions. Imani felt her stomach clench with a familiar wave of anxiety as she skimmed through the comments, some supportive and encouraging, others vicious and condemning, all missing the larger picture of what had really happened, the complex web of power and privilege that underlay the surface drama. She quickly typed back a brief response. "I'm fine. Question for you. What do you know about Sterling Enterprises?" The response came within minutes, accompanied by an urgent phone call that would change everything, redirecting the course of her life in ways she could never have imagined. "Imani, honey, you need to be incredibly careful." Jessica's voice was low and urgent, barely above a whisper. "Sterling Enterprises is currently under investigation by the SEC. I can't say much more over the phone, but let's just say there are some rather significant irregularities in their quarterly reports that would make your finance professors weep." The next morning, Imani woke to find that her suspension had been swiftly and efficiently upgraded to termination, the official notice delivered via a terse text message from David Thompson, a cowardly act that was both entirely predictable and utterly expected. He couldn't even be bothered to fire her in person, choosing instead to hide behind the shield of corporate policy and the convenient excuse of potential legal liability. But as she deleted the message, a different notification caught her attention, a news alert flashing across her screen about Sterling Enterprises stock plummeting a staggering 12% in after-hours trading. The timing, she realized, was far too convenient to be coincidental. Someone was deliberately dumping shares, and smart money was frantically running for the exits before whatever scandal was brewing became public knowledge. A full-blown financial tsunami that threatened to wipe out everything in its path. Imani immediately took a screenshot of the article, adding it to her growing digital file, another crucial piece of the puzzle that was slowly but surely beginning to form a recognizable shape. That afternoon, Victoria Sterling swept back into Le Jardin like a conquering general returning to claim her trophy. Her head held high, her eyes blazing with a mixture of triumph and vindictive glee. She specifically requested Imani's former section, making a calculated show of ostentatiously examining the wine list while regaling her lunch companions with increasingly embellished tales of the previous evening's dramatic confrontation. Some people simply don't understand their place in society, Victoria proclaimed loudly, making sure her voice carried far enough for the entire dining room to hear. But I taught that little waitress a lesson she won't soon forget. The other servers moved through their duties with the careful, almost robotic precision of people who knew they were being watched and judged, their every move scrutinized. Management had made it abundantly clear that any show of sympathy or solidarity for their former colleague, any deviation from the prescribed script of subservient obedience, would result in immediate termination. Fear, as always, was a powerful motivator, and Victoria Sterling wielded it like a master craftsman, skillfully manipulating the emotions of those around her. But Victoria's self-congratulatory victory tour, her moment of unbridled triumph, was about to encounter an unexpected and potentially devastating obstacle. As she pontificated about proper respect and the rigid social hierarchy, she failed to notice the unassuming woman in the impeccably tailored business suit sitting 2 tables away, discreetly taking careful notes and recording every word on her cell phone. Imani had returned to Le Jardin, not as a lowly server, but as a paying customer, having used her emergency credit card, her last line of financial defense, to purchase a meal she could barely afford and acquire clothes that transformed her from a service worker into a polished professional. The transformation, she knew, was remarkable, a testament to the power of appearances in a world obsessed with superficiality. The same woman who had been summarily dismissed as insignificant just yesterday now commanded a level of respect from the hostess and a degree of deference from the waitstaff that she had never experienced before. Appearance, she was learning, was everything in this world, and Imani was determined to master the rules of the game, to use the tools of her oppressors against them. As Victoria's voice rose, her claims becoming increasingly grandiose and delusional, she revealed information that made Imani's pulse quicken with anticipation, her eyes widening with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. References to previously undisclosed offshore accounts, casual mentions of temporary relocations of assets to safer havens, and knowing winks about flexible interpretations of tax law, all delivered with the casual confidence of someone who believed themselves to be completely untouchable, above the law, immune to consequences. Victoria Sterling, in her arrogance and hubris, was effectively confessing to a string of financial crimes in a room full of potential witnesses, her every incriminating word captured on a recording device that would meticulously preserve her self-incriminating testimony for posterity. The irony, Imani thought, was almost too beautiful in its simplicity, a perfect example of poetic justice. The same blinding arrogance that had led her to publicly humiliate a waitress was now unwittingly providing the very evidence needed to bring about her own downfall. Imani smiled inwardly as she discreetly saved the recording, adding another crucial piece to the intricate puzzle that was rapidly taking shape with stunning clarity. The game, she realized, had well and truly begun, and Victoria Sterling, in her self-assured ignorance, had absolutely no idea she was already losing. 3 days later, Imani stood outside Le Jardin, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach, wearing her old server uniform, a calculated risk that could either provide her with the critical intelligence she desperately needed or result in an embarrassing trespassing charge. She had called in a favor from Maria Santos, one of the few servers brave enough to maintain contact with her after her unceremonious termination, a loyal friend who had agreed to let her work a private catering shift for Victoria's upcoming intimate dinner party. The event, she knew, was strictly invitation only, a gathering of the city's elite power brokers, a clandestine meeting to discuss matters of mutual interest. The invitation, Imani had learned, cryptically referred to mutually beneficial investment opportunities, a thinly veiled euphemism for shady deals and corrupt practices. Imani adjusted her name tag, the familiar plastic digging uncomfortably into her skin, and checked her hidden recording device one final time, making sure it was fully charged and properly positioned. Tonight, she vowed, she would gather the irrefutable evidence needed to dismantle an empire built on a foundation of corruption and cruelty, one recorded confession at a time. The private dining room buzzed with the hushed murmur of confidential conversation, the kind of unguarded exchanges that typically occurred when people believed themselves safely insulated from scrutiny and consequences. Victoria held court at the head of the table, resplendent in a breathtaking midnight blue Valentino gown that undoubtedly cost more than most people's annual salaries, regaling her captive audience with exaggerated tales of her recent business triumphs and social conquests. The beauty of international banking, she was saying as Amani refilled water glasses with practiced invisibility, moving through the room like a ghost in black and white, is that money becomes wonderfully fluid. Numbers can dance between accounts like ballet dancers, appearing here, disappearing there, always in motion, always elusive. The men around the table chuckled appreciatively, their eyes glinting with avarice, while their wives nodded in knowing agreement, offering the kind of subtle smiles that came from years of looking the other way, of turning a blind eye to the illicit sources of their considerable wealth. These were not people who asked uncomfortable questions about the origins of their comfort, who dared to challenge the established order. As Amani moved through the room like a silent observer, a ghost in the machine, she caught fragments of incriminating conversation that could potentially end careers, shatter reputations, and send powerful individuals to prison if properly recorded and presented to the right authorities. Richard Sterling, Victoria's husband, his face flushed with the glow of alcohol and self-importance, was animatedly discussing the finer points of shell company creation with the enthusiasm of a skilled craftsman describing his art. The key is layering, he explained, gesturing expansively with a crystal tumbler of 30-year-old scotch. Company A owns Company B, which then has partnerships with Company C, and so on and so forth. By the time anyone even attempts to trace the ownership, the convoluted paper trail leads to nothing more than a post office box in the Cayman Islands. The casual admission of what amounted to a conspiracy to commit tax evasion hung in the air like an expensive perfume, overwhelming and obvious, and yet somehow completely ignored by everyone present except for the woman silently serving their wine. Victoria's voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the murmur of criminal confession like a conductor calling her orchestra to attention. Speaking of fluid arrangements, Richard and I have decided that it's time to diversify our portfolio geographically, she announced, her eyes sparkling with mischievous glee. Some of our more liquid assets will be taking an extended vacation in Switzerland, at least until this unfortunate SEC investigation resolves itself. She uttered the words with the kind of casual confidence that only came from a lifetime of believing that the rules applied to other people, that she was somehow above the law. The guests nodded knowingly, a chorus of complicity, several discreetly pulling out their cell phones to presumably make similar arrangements for their own assets, preparing to shift their ill-gotten gains to safer, more clandestine locations. Amani's hands remained steady as she served the next course, a delicate sea base prepared with lemon and herbs, but her mind was racing with the implications of what she was hearing, processing the information with the precision of a seasoned intelligence analyst. Victoria Sterling, in her reckless arrogance, had just confessed to obstruction of justice and money laundering in front of a dozen witnesses, essentially providing the prosecution with all the evidence they needed to build an airtight case against her. The conversation took an even more damaging turn when the topic shifted to Richard Sterling's recent business challenges, the regulatory hurdles that were threatening to derail his construction projects. Richard Sterling's voice, usually booming and confident, carried a rare note of frustration as he described his company's ongoing regulatory problems. These inspector types think they're so clever, he grumbled, swirling the scotch in his glass, but they don't understand that construction is ultimately a relationship business. Sometimes you just need to encourage certain relationships to flourish, if you catch my drift. His meaning, veiled in euphemisms, was perfectly clear to everyone in the room, and the knowing nods of understanding that rippled through the gathering confirmed that bribery and corruption were as commonplace in their privileged circle as extravagant charity galas and luxurious yacht parties. Victoria laughed, a brittle, almost manic sound, raising her wine glass in a mock toast, to creative problem-solving and flexible interpretations of bureaucratic guidelines. The glasses clinked together in a discordant symphony of complicity, a chorus of criminal intent that would undoubtedly have federal investigators working overtime within the week. But Victoria's moment of unbridled triumph, her self-satisfied celebration of unchecked power and privilege, was about to encounter an unexpected and devastating complication. As Imani leaned over to refill her wine glass, the millionaire's wife glanced up, her eyes narrowing with suspicion, and a flicker of recognition, swift and unsettling, flashed across her face like a sudden lightning strike. "Wait a minute," Victoria said slowly, her voice suddenly cold and hard, cutting through the convivial dinner party chatter like a finely honed blade. "I know you. You're that waitress from the other night, the one who was so rude to me." The room fell silent, as if someone had suddenly flipped a switch, plunging the gathering into an unnerving stillness. All attention, every curious eye, focused on Imani, who suddenly found herself trapped in the harsh spotlight, her carefully constructed facade threatening to crumble under the weight of scrutiny. Her cover, she knew, was officially blown, her carefully laid plans thrown into disarray. But the recording device in her pocket, she reminded herself, had already captured enough irrefutable evidence to potentially destroy everyone at this table, to unravel their carefully constructed web of deceit and corruption. The question now, she realized, was whether she could escape before Victoria's simmering fury boiled over into something far more dangerous than mere public humiliation. "Security!" Victoria's shriek shattered the elegant atmosphere like a hammer shattering a fragile crystal vase, the sound echoing through the room with alarming force. "This woman is trespassing. She was fired from this restaurant, and now she's obviously here to cause trouble." The guests began murmuring nervously among themselves, some reaching for their cell phones to dial for assistance, while others demanded explanations from their increasingly flustered hosts. Richard Sterling's face drained of color as the full implications of what had just happened began to sink in, dawning on him with terrifying clarity. A former employee, someone with obvious and well-founded grievances against his wife, had been secretly listening to their private business discussions, recording their every incriminating word. The paranoia that came so naturally to people with secrets, those who lived their lives constantly looking over their shoulders, began spreading through the room like a rapidly spreading wildfire. How much had she heard? What did she know? More importantly, what was she planning to do with whatever information she had gathered? Imani, maintaining an outward semblance of calm, began backing slowly towards the service entrance, her hand instinctively reaching for the handle. Freedom, she knew, was just seconds away. She paused at the doorway, turning back for one final, lingering look at the room full of criminals in designer clothes, carefully memorizing faces and voices that would soon be explaining themselves to federal investigators. "I was just helping Maria with the catering," she said calmly, her voice ringing with clarity through the suddenly silent room. "Though I have to say, this has been quite an educational evening. I've learned so much about creative accounting and international business practices." The subtle but unmistakable threat hanging in her words was not lost on Victoria, whose carefully constructed composure cracked visibly, her carefully applied makeup unable to conceal the raw fury tightening her jaw and the genuine fear widening her eyes. The millionaire's wife, who had spent years wielding power through intimidation and social influence, had never before faced an opponent who possessed information that could not only undermine her authority, but also potentially destroy her entire carefully constructed world. For the first time in her pampered and privileged life, Victoria Sterling was genuinely afraid. "Get her out of here immediately," Victoria commanded, her voice barely a whisper, betraying a note of sheer panic that significantly undermined her authority. "And I want her arrested for trespassing, industrial espionage, and whatever else we can possibly charge her with." The security guards, responding to the urgency in Victoria's voice, moved purposefully toward Imani, their faces grim, their intentions clear. But Imani was already at the service door, her hand firmly on the handle, freedom just seconds away. She paused for one last moment, offering a small, almost imperceptible smile, and delivering a parting shot that was as elegant as it was devastating. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Imani said with perfect politeness, her words carrying the weight of a promise and a threat, subtly combined. "I look forward to seeing you all again very soon." As the service door swung shut behind her, cutting off the sound of Victoria's increasingly hysterical screams. Imani could hear the millionaire's wife berating the hapless security team, demanding they find her, retrieve the recording equipment, and erase any trace of the incriminating evidence she might have collected. But it was already too late. The evidence, meticulously gathered and carefully preserved, was already beyond their reach, safely stored in multiple secure locations, with copies prepared for the appropriate authorities. Victoria Sterling, blinded by her own arrogance and fueled by her unshakable belief in her own invincibility, had underestimated her opponent once again, and this time, the mistake would undoubtedly cost her everything. The information was gathered, the confessions recorded, and the wheels of justice, however slow and cumbersome, were already irrevocably in motion. Retribution, Imani knew, was no longer a distant hope, but an almost inevitable certainty. The law office of Marcus Washington, a name whispered with both respect and fear in legal circles, occupied the 15th floor of a gleaming downtown high-rise, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the city that had both nurtured and tested him, that had tried to break both him and the young woman sitting across from his impeccably polished mahogany desk. Marcus was a man who understood the immense weight of fighting against seemingly insurmountable systems, powerful forces that were intentionally designed to crush people like them, those who dared to challenge the established order. His prestigious Harvard law degree, a symbol of his hard-earned success, hung proudly beside framed photos of iconic civil rights leaders, a constant reminder of the battles fought and the sacrifices made for equality and justice. His impressive track record of successfully taking down white-collar criminals, exposing their lies and holding them accountable for their actions, had earned him both unwavering respect and powerful enemies in equal measure. "Miss Rose," he said, his voice deep and resonant, studying the small flash drive she had placed before him on the desk like a crucial chess piece, a potential game-changer. "What you've brought me today, if it's what I believe it is, could potentially change everything. But before we proceed any further, I need you to fully understand the inherent risks involved in what you're proposing, the potential consequences you could face." His voice, filled with a quiet gravity, carried the weight of someone who had witnessed too many David versus Goliath battles end in tragedy, who had seen too many idealistic crusaders crushed beneath the weight of powerful and scrupulous adversaries. Imani leaned forward slightly in her chair, her posture radiating an unwavering determination that came from having nothing left to lose, from having reached the point where the only option was to fight back. "Mr. Washington, I've already lost my job, my reputation has been tarnished, and I've very nearly lost my dignity," she said, her voice unwavering. "Victoria Sterling has made it abundantly clear that she intends to ruin my life simply because I refused to kneel before her, because I dared to defy her authority." She gestured towards the small flash drive sitting on the desk, the unassuming vessel containing hours of secretly recorded confessions from Lajardin's private dining room, the evidence that could potentially bring down an entire empire built on greed and corruption. These people think they're untouchable because they've never faced any meaningful consequences for their actions, because they've always been able to buy their way out of trouble. It's time someone showed them that the law, at least in theory, applies to everyone, regardless of how much money they have stashed in offshore accounts. Marcus picked up the flash drive, carefully turning it over in his hands, weighing its potential impact against the inevitable retaliation it would provoke, considering the immense resources and influence that the Sterlings would undoubtedly bring to bear in their defense. "I've been investigating financial crimes for 12 years, Miss Rose, and in that time I've learned one crucial lesson. People like the Sterlings don't fight fair. They'll use every dirty trick in the book, every resource at their disposal, to tear apart anyone who threatens their empire, anyone who dares to challenge their power." He walked slowly to his expansive window, gazing down at the sprawling city below, the city where justice was supposed to be blind, but often seemed to need prescription glasses when looking at the wealthy and powerful. 3 years ago, Victoria Sterling ended. Victoria Sterling, a woman of immense power and influence, had made a grave error when she decided to publicly humiliate Marcus Washington, a respected lawyer, at the mayor's charity auction the previous month. Imani, sensing the simmering rage beneath Marcus's professional demeanor, questioned his willingness to help her, already suspecting the answer. "Because," Marcus said, his voice hardening, Victoria Sterling made a mistake when she decided to humiliate me at the mayor's charity auction last month. She stood up in front of 500 people and suggested that lawyers like me weren't qualified to handle real cases involving serious money. The memory still stung, transforming the composed attorney into a man who understood the injustice Imani was fighting. As Marcus played the recordings from the flash drive, his expression morphed from detached professional to one of barely concealed excitement. Richard Sterling's voice filled the office, casually detailing money laundering techniques with the practiced ease of a seasoned criminal. Victoria's laughter echoed through the speakers as she toasted their creative interpretation of tax law while their guests, a who's who of the city's elite, nodded in agreement, complicit in their scheme. "This is incredible," Marcus breathed, pausing the recording to scribble furious notes. "We have conspiracy to commit tax evasion, obstruction of justice, money laundering, and what sounds like the systematic bribery of city officials. Any one of these charges could cripple them, but together, this is a federal prosecutor's dream case." The evidence was solid, secure, and ready for a courtroom presentation. Marcus began to outline their strategy, his mind working with the precision of a general planning a complex military campaign. "We'll need to coordinate with federal authorities, but timing is critical. The Sterlings are clearly planning to move assets offshore, so we need to act quickly before they can escape with their ill-gotten gains." He pulled up financial databases on his computer, cross-referencing shell companies and banking records with the information gleaned from Imani's recordings. "I've been quietly building a network of other victims over the years, people whose careers or businesses were destroyed by the Sterlings' influence. With your evidence, we can finally bring them the justice they've been denied." The sheer scale of the Sterlings' corruption became chillingly apparent, a vast web of ruined lives and stolen opportunities stretching back decades. But their intense planning session was abruptly interrupted by Marcus's secretary, who knocked urgently on the door before entering with a worried expression. "Mr. Washington, there are 2 men in the lobby claiming to be private investigators. They're asking questions about Miss Rose and whether she's been in contact with you." The message was clear. Victoria Sterling's retaliation had already begun, faster than either of them had anticipated. Marcus and Imani exchanged a knowing glance that spoke volumes about the danger that now surrounded them. They're being very polite, but also very persistent. They mentioned something about industrial espionage and corporate theft. The legal battle was about to become intensely personal, testing both their resolve and their safety in ways they could scarcely imagine. Marcus moved quickly to secure the recordings, making multiple copies of the flash drive while simultaneously outlining their next steps for Imani. "We need to file with federal authorities immediately before the Sterlings can claim the recordings were obtained illegally. I'll also reach out to my contacts at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. They've been looking for a way to crack the Sterling organization for years." He handed her a secure phone and a business card for a safe house service. "From this moment forward, you need to assume you're being watched. Don't go home tonight. Don't contact anyone from your old life. And don't trust anyone except me and the federal agents I'm going to introduce you to." As Imani prepared to leave through the building's service entrance, Marcus delivered one final piece of information, a revelation that changed everything. "There's something else you should know about Victoria Sterling's pattern of eliminating black professionals in this city. It's not random, and it's not just about protecting her husband's business. She's part of a coordinated effort to maintain what she calls appropriate demographic balance in positions of influence." He revealed a folder containing documentation of 23 separate cases over the past decade, where successful black professionals had been systematically targeted and neutralized. "You're not just fighting for your own justice, Imani. You're fighting for every person whose life she's deliberately ruined because of the color of their skin." But as Imani slipped out into the cold night, her secure phone buzzed with an urgent text message that sent a shiver down her spine. It was from the hospital where her mother, Dorothy Rose, was receiving long-term treatment. The message was stark. Urgent contact requested immediately. Dorothy Rose's condition had deteriorated rapidly during the evening, her weakened immune system unable to fend off a secondary infection. The doctors were now recommending emergency surgery, a procedure that carried a staggering $50,000 price tag, money Imani simply didn't have and couldn't possibly acquire through legitimate means in time. The alliance had been forged, and the legal machinery was now in motion. But the cruelest test of her resolve had just begun. The hospital corridor reeked of disinfectant and despair, a familiar and unwelcome combination that had haunted Imani's nights for months. She stood outside her mother's room, clutching the doctor's grim estimate for the emergency surgery. $50,000, an astronomical sum that might as well have been 50 million. Dorothy Rose lay motionless, connected to a complex array of machines that beeped out the uneven rhythm of a life hanging precariously in the balance. Her once strong and capable hands were now as fragile as autumn leaves, resting against the sterile white sheets. The infection is extremely aggressive, Dr. Martinez explained in a carefully measured tone, the tone reserved for delivering impossible news. Without immediate intervention, her immune system simply won't be able to fight it off. The surgery is her only chance, but I have to be honest about the financial reality. The devastating words hung in the sterile air like a death sentence wrapped in sterile medical terminology. 3 days later, Imani found herself back at Le Jardin, forced to don the humiliating black server's uniform that felt like a costume from another person's life. David Thompson, Victoria Sterling's obsequious manager, had called personally, his voice dripping with false sympathy as he offered her old job back, albeit at reduced hours and significantly lower pay. Mrs. Sterling specifically requested that you be given a second chance, he had said, the lie so transparent it was almost insulting. She believes in redemption and forgiveness. The truth was far simpler and infinitely more sinister. Victoria wanted her enemy close, where she could be closely watched, carefully controlled, and ultimately broken. Imani swallowed her pride and accepted the demeaning offer, because her mother's life depended on the meager income, no matter how deeply it wounded her soul. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford when measured against the steady, relentless beep of her mother's life support machines. Victoria's lavish birthday celebration transformed Le Jardin's main dining room into a grotesque showcase of excessive wealth that would have made even Roman emperors blush with shame. 50 of the city's most influential citizens gathered to worship at the glittering altar of wealth and power, their designer gowns and impeccably tailored suits creating a human tapestry of privilege. Crystal chandeliers cast shimmering prisms across tables laden with imported caviar, truffle-infused delicacies, and vintage wines that cost more per bottle than most families spent on groceries in an entire month. Victoria held court at the center of it all, resplendent in a custom Versace gown that clung to her surgically enhanced figure like liquid gold. Tonight, she announced to her assembled courtiers, her voice amplified by hidden microphones, is about celebrating not just another year of life, but another year of knowing exactly where we all belong in the natural order of things. As Imani moved silently through the glittering crowd with practiced invisibility, serving champagne to people who looked right through her as if she were a piece of furniture, Victoria's voice carried with chilling clarity across the vast room. Some people in this city, she said, her eyes locking onto Imani with predatory precision, have recently forgotten their place. They've developed ideas far above their station, foolishly thinking they can challenge those who were born to lead. The wealthy crowd murmured their enthusiastic agreement, while expensive smartphones discreetly emerged from purses and pockets to capture what promised to be another viral moment of social dominance. But I believe in teaching lessons that stick, Victoria continued, her voice dripping with cold calculation. In making sure that order is meticulously maintained, and that respect is earned through the proper channels. Her smile was as sharp and brittle as broken glass, and every carefully chosen word was calculated to remind Imani of her utterly powerless position. The public humiliation escalated as the evening wore on, each calculated insult designed to chip away at what little remained of Imani's dignity. Victoria demanded that she personally serve every single course at the head table, ensuring maximum visibility for her complete and utter subjugation. "My dear friends," Victoria announced during the main course, her voice carrying the unquestionable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I want you all to meet someone very special. This is Imani, a perfect example of how second chances can teach valuable lessons about the importance of knowing one's place in this world." The introduction was delivered with the kind of patronizing tone usually reserved for describing trained animals performing tricks for the amusement of their owners. "Tell everyone what you've learned, Imani. Share your newfound wisdom about the importance of respect and appropriate behavior." The request was phrased as a polite suggestion, but everyone in the room understood perfectly well that it was an absolute command, and that disobedience would be met with swift and merciless consequences. Imani stood frozen in the harsh spotlight of 50 pairs of expectant eyes, the oppressive weight of their combined judgment pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. Her mother's frail face flashed through her mind. Dorothy rose, fighting for every single breath while her daughter stood here being paraded like a trophy of submission. The mounting hospital bills loomed large in her thoughts, and the life-saving surgery couldn't wait much longer. This demeaning job was her only tenuous lifeline to keeping her mother alive. Every instinct screamed at her to fight back, to tear down this elaborate charade, to reveal who she really was and what she knew about the vast criminal enterprise masquerading as high society. But the steady, rhythmic beep of those life support machines echoed relentlessly in her memory, drowning out the powerful voice of rebellion with the stark, inescapable sound of medical necessity. "I've learned," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "that everyone has their place in this world." The hushed crowd leaned forward expectantly, sensing imminent victory, and eager to witness the complete and utter capitulation of someone who had dared to challenge their firmly established social order. Victoria's carefully constructed smile widened with each agonizing word, savoring the moment of triumph like a rare and expensive wine. But as Imani continued speaking, something in her voice began to subtly change, slowly growing stronger and more resolute despite the glistening tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. "I've learned that some people mistakenly believe they can buy respect, that money can somehow purchase the right to humiliate others without consequence." Her hand moved unconsciously to her pocket, where her mother's small, embroidered napkin rested against her heart like a sacred talisman. "I've learned that there are people in this very room who actually believe their wealth makes them untouchable, that their carefully concealed crimes will never see the light of day because they can easily buy silence and intimidate witnesses." The temperature in the opulent room seemed to drop 10 degrees as the full implications of her words began to sink in. Victoria's triumphant expression faltered imperceptibly as she realized that her carefully orchestrated moment of victory was rapidly transforming into something else entirely, something far more dangerous and completely beyond her control. "That's quite enough," she snapped, her voice cracking through the sudden tension like a sharp whip. "You're here to serve, not to lecture your betters about morality." But Imani was no longer listening to empty commands issued by someone whose power was built on a precarious foundation of lies, stolen money, and the systematic exploitation of others. The breaking point had finally been reached, and something fundamental had irrevocably shifted in the carefully calibrated balance of power between them. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Sterling," Imani said, her voice now carrying clearly to every corner of the shocked room. "I am indeed here to serve, but not in the way you think." She pulled out her secure phone, her fingers dancing across the screen with practiced efficiency. "I'm here to serve justice, and it's about to be delivered hot and fresh." The luxurious room erupted into confused murmurs as the assembled guests began to realize that the evening's carefully planned entertainment had taken an unexpected and potentially disastrous turn. Victoria's perfectly made-up face cycled rapidly through a spectrum of conflicting emotions. Confusion, disbelief, mounting anger, and finally, the cold, creeping fear of someone who suddenly understood that they had drastically underestimated their opponent, and that their carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around them. "Security!" she screamed, her voice a strangled whisper. But her desperate command was instantly drowned out by the sound of Imani's phone connecting seamlessly to the restaurant's state-of-the-art sound system. Marcus Washington's voice filled the stunned silence of LeJardin's dining room, calm and authoritative as he began reading aloud from a federal warrant that had been filed with the court that very afternoon. The extravagant party was officially over, and the real show was about to begin. Marcus Washington's voice, amplified by the sound system, filled the shocked silence of LeJardin's opulent dining room with the unmistakable authority of federal law. Each precisely articulated word cut through the champagne-soaked atmosphere like a surgeon's scalpel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice calm and professional. "This is Attorney Marcus Washington, representing the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. We have credible evidence of extensive money laundering and conspiracy to defraud the United States government, involving several individuals present at this gathering." The carefully orchestrated recording continued, as the assembled guests frantically reached for their cell phones, some desperately calling their high-priced lawyers, while others frantically tried to calculate their own potential exposure to the Sterling's vast criminal enterprise. Victoria stood frozen at the head of the room, her flawless makeup unable to completely conceal the raw terror that was now spreading across her face like spilled red wine on pristine white silk. The sprawling federal investigation had moved with the ruthless precision and unwavering speed of a carefully planned military operation once Marcus had delivered Amani's meticulously gathered recordings to the appropriate federal authorities. A team of highly skilled FBI forensic accountants had worked 72 hours straight, tirelessly tracing the intricate digital breadcrumbs of the Sterling's Byzantine financial empire, following the flow of illicit money through a complex maze of shell companies, offshore accounts, and fraudulent transactions that spanned 3 continents. Agent Sarah Chun, the lead investigator for the Financial Crimes Unit, had privately described it as the most comprehensive and sophisticated white-collar criminal organization she had encountered in her 15 years of dedicated federal service. "These people didn't simply bend the rules," she had told Marcus during their final pre-raid briefing. "They created their own entirely separate financial system, specifically designed to systematically avoid paying taxes, conceal assets from scrutiny, and launder vast sums of illicit money on an almost industrial scale." The sheer volume of incriminating documentation was staggering, both in its overwhelming scope and its meticulous precision. Richard Sterling's powerful construction company had been systematically overcharging the city for numerous public works projects, while simultaneously bribing city inspectors to deliberately overlook critical safety violations that had needlessly put countless construction workers at serious risk. Victoria, meanwhile, had skillfully used her vast network of charitable organizations as elaborate fronts for moving and laundering dirty money, brazenly skimming generous donations intended for desperately needed homeless shelters and critically underfunded children's hospitals to directly fund their own lavish and extravagant lifestyle. The power couple had surreptitiously transferred well over $200 million to secret accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Luxembourg, using a complex web of meticulously crafted fake companies with innocuous-sounding names like Global Wellness Solutions and International Humanitarian Partners. Each individual transaction had been carefully structured to cleverly avoid detection by automated banking systems, but sophisticated human analysis had revealed clear and unmistakable patterns that painted a damning picture of deliberate and systematic criminal intent. Amani's highly refined financial analysis skills, honed through years of rigorous MBA coursework and practical application, had proven absolutely invaluable in meticulously mapping the full extent of the Sterling's extensive criminal network. She had spent 3 consecutive sleepless nights hunched over her computer, creating incredibly detailed spreadsheets and flowcharts that painstakingly traced every single dollar from its illegal source to its carefully hidden destination, building a robust and irrefutable case so comprehensive that even the most expensive and resourceful defense attorneys would struggle mightily to create even a shred of reasonable doubt in the minds of a jury. The inherent beauty of financial crimes, she had quietly explained to Marcus while meticulously building their airtight presentation, is that even the smartest criminals always leave an unavoidable paper trail. They simply can't help themselves. They desperately need meticulous documentation to keep accurate track of their own elaborate lies and complex financial transactions. Her exhaustive analysis had conclusively identified no fewer than 17 separate and distinct violations of federal banking laws, each carrying potential prison sentences that could add up to life behind bars. But even as the sprawling federal case gained considerable momentum, a desperate Victoria Sterling had launched her own ruthless counterattack, carefully designed to systematically discredit and intimidate the key witnesses building the robust prosecution against her and her husband. Highly paid private investigators had been secretly following both Amani and Marcus for days, discreetly photographing their confidential meetings and desperately attempting to dig up any potentially compromising information that could be used to publicly question their credibility and damage their reputations. Anonymous tips had been called in to the FBI, maliciously suggesting that the incriminating recordings were fabricated, or that sensitive material had been strategically planted by disgruntled former employees seeking revenge for imagined slights. Victoria had even personally contacted the hospital where Dorothy Rose was receiving her critical medical treatment, subtly suggesting that perhaps the family's well-known financial difficulties might make them particularly susceptible to accepting bribes from overzealous federal agents looking to manufacture a flimsy case against innocent and upstanding business people. The intense psychological warfare was immense, meticulously designed to erode Imani's unwavering willpower before the high-stakes case could even reach trial. Victoria's high-powered lawyers had filed frivolous restraining orders claiming harassment, while her sophisticated public relations team skillfully leaked carefully crafted stories to the local media, suggesting that a troubled former waitress was making demonstrably false accusations in a cynical attempt to extort money from a prominent and well-respected family. The coordinated attacks were both relentless and highly professional, specifically targeting not only Imani's personal and professional credibility, but also her overall mental health and the fragile stability of her family. "She wants you to break," Marcus had bluntly warned during one of their secure phone conversations. "She's betting that the immense strain will force you to make mistakes, or simply give up on everything entirely. But what she doesn't understand is that every single attack she makes only creates more meticulously documented evidence of obstruction of justice, which will ultimately be used against her in court." The final and critical piece of the intricate puzzle came from a completely unexpected source: Victoria's own personal accountant, a quiet and unassuming man who had been diligently documenting his powerful client's illegal activities for years, as a form of personal insurance against exactly this type of wide-ranging investigation. Harold Brennan had worked for the Sterling family for over a decade, creating the complex financial instruments they used to meticulously hide their rapidly accumulating wealth, while also keeping detailed and confidential records of every single transaction, just in case he needed to protect himself from potential prosecution. When FBI agents showed up unexpectedly at his office with a valid search warrant, he had readily handed over boxes of meticulously organized documents that fully corroborated every single detail of Imani's exhaustive financial analysis. "I've been patiently waiting for someone to finally investigate these people," he told Agent Chun during his extensive debriefing. "What they've been doing isn't just blatantly illegal. It's a deep and personal insult to everyone who honestly pays their taxes and dutifully follows the law." The comprehensive paper trail was now complete and completely irrefutable. A mountain of damning financial documents, secretly recorded confessions, and sworn witness testimony that painted a vivid picture of systematic criminal behavior spanning decades. Victoria and Richard Sterling had brazenly stolen money from legitimate charities, defrauded the government of millions of dollars in unpaid tax revenue, and systematically used their vast wealth to corrupt public officials at every level of city government. The massive case file now ran to well over 3,000 pages, but the core and essential facts were simple enough for any reasonably intelligent jury to readily understand. The Sterling family had ruthlessly built their vast empire on a shaky foundation of lies, calculated theft, and the unconscionable suffering of others. Federal prosecutors were now supremely confident that they had compiled enough overwhelming evidence to easily secure multiple convictions that would undoubtedly result in decades of prison time, and the complete forfeiture of the Sterling's ill-gotten fortune. As news of the far-reaching investigation began to leak to the voracious media, a desperate Victoria made one final, ill-advised attempt to simply buy her way out of justice. Through a series of shady intermediaries, she offered Imani a substantial payment of $100,000 in exchange for simply recanting her sworn testimony and falsely admitting that the damaging recordings had been fabricated. The tantalizing offer came with both thinly veiled threats about what might potentially happen to her mother's critical medical care if she refused to cooperate, and equally enticing promises of ongoing payments that could permanently solve all of Dorothy Rose's long-term health problems. "Think carefully about what really matters here," the anonymous message had chillingly said. "Your mother's precious life is ultimately worth far more than some abstract concept of justice." But Imani's resolute response had been both swift and absolutely unambiguous. Justice wasn't merely an abstract concept. especially when it meant preventing other families from being systematically destroyed by powerful people who wrongly believed that their considerable wealth somehow put them above the reach of the law. The intricate web they had meticulously built to carefully hide their many crimes now pulled them inexorably under, with a relentless and unstoppable force. Victoria Sterling's corrupt empire was crumbling rapidly as seasoned federal prosecutors finalized the complex charges that would undoubtedly reshape how white-collar financial crimes were prosecuted in the city's busy courtrooms. Tomorrow, the cold handcuffs would finally click shut on wrists far more accustomed to wearing diamond bracelets, and a powerful new chapter in the ongoing fight for justice would begin. The grand ballroom of the prestigious Metropolitan Hotel had been skillfully transformed into a glittering temple of carefully calculated philanthropy, where 200 of the city's most influential citizens had gathered for Victoria Sterling's highly anticipated annual charity gala benefiting local children's hospitals. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm and inviting light over exquisitely decorated tables draped in the finest silk, while attentive servers moved discreetly through the well-dressed crowd, offering flutes of expensive champagne and delicate canapés that cost more per bite than many struggling families spent on their entire dinner. Victoria stood confidently at the very center of it all, resplendent in a stunning custom Saint Laurent gown that clung to her sculpted figure like shimmering liquid silver, graciously accepting praise and generous donations with the natural grace and ease of someone who had been born to command attention and effortlessly receive admiration. Tonight, she announced to the assembled crowd of well-heeled guests, her amplified voice radiating the unshakable authority of someone who had simply never been denied anything she truly desired. We celebrate the immense power of giving. We celebrate the inherent responsibility that comes with extraordinary success, and the binding obligation to lift up those less fortunate than ourselves. It was truly breathtaking in its sheer audacity. The carefully orchestrated spectacle of a ruthless thief piously preaching selfless generosity, while simultaneously positioning herself as a compassionate champion of the disadvantaged and downtrodden. Local television camera crews diligently captured every single moment of her carefully practiced performance, broadcasting it live to viewers across the entire city, most of whom had absolutely no idea they were actually watching a master criminal in her final hours of freedom. Victoria's polished speech about compassion and heartfelt social responsibility drew thunderous applause from an adoring audience that included influential judges, powerful politicians, and prominent business leaders, many of whom would soon be answering some very uncomfortable questions about their own close connections to the crumbling Sterling Empire. "We must never forget," Victoria continued, her voice rising with carefully practiced emotion, "that with great wealth inevitably comes great responsibility." The carefully chosen words dripped with rehearsed sincerity as she gestured theatrically toward strategically placed donation displays, prominently showing touching photographs of desperately sick children and visibly homeless families. "We must all use our considerable resources not just to selfishly enrich ourselves, but to actively build a far better world for all future generations." The long-awaited moment of reckoning finally arrived, cleverly disguised as just another guest casually making her way through the elegantly dressed crowd. Imani Rose entered the crowded ballroom, not surreptitiously through the dimly lit service entrance she had been forced to use for the past several months, but boldly through the grand main doors, walking with the unwavering confidence of someone who rightfully belonged in this exclusive world of immense power and vast privilege. Gone was the demeaning black server's uniform that had previously rendered her practically invisible to these powerful people. In its place, she wore a perfectly tailored navy blue business suit that instantly transformed her from a lowly servant into a respected equal. Her strong and confident posture radiated the natural authority that came from years of rigorous MBA training and months of meticulous preparation. The stunning transformation was so complete and utterly convincing that several guests who had previously looked right through her countless times now found themselves strangely drawn to her commanding presence, subtly sensing something fundamentally different about the poised and determined woman moving purposefully through their carefully organized ranks with such quiet and undeniable purpose. Victoria's carefully cultivated triumphant smile faltered almost imperceptibly when she finally spotted Imani confidently approaching the stage, a flicker of chilling recognition flashing briefly across her face like a bolt of lightning before a violent storm. "Ladies and gentlemen, Imani's clear voice suddenly cut smoothly through the polite ballroom chatter with the undeniable clarity and assurance of someone expertly trained to command attention in high-pressure boardrooms. My name is Dr. Imani Rose, and I have something extremely important to share with you all tonight. The hushed crowd turned as one, instantly drawn by the unexpected and unwelcome interruption of their otherwise carefully choreographed evening of opulent self-congratulation. Victoria moved swiftly toward the conveniently placed microphone, clearly intending to quickly regain complete control of her spiraling event. But Imani was already speaking, her clear voice radiating the quiet authority that came from possessing critical information that could potentially change the course of countless lives. Many of you know me simply as the waitress who politely served your tables, the invisible woman who silently brought your drinks and quietly cleaned up your messes. But what you don't know is that I also hold a highly regarded MBA from Harvard Business School. Audible gasps rippled noticeably through the shocked room as the assembled guests began to slowly realize that their carefully planned evening of smug self-congratulation was rapidly transforming into something else entirely, something far more dangerous and decidedly less flattering. Victoria's face cycled quickly through a complex series of powerful emotions. Initial confusion, simmering rage, and finally, the chilling cold fear of someone who suddenly understood that their entire world was rapidly crumbling in real time. "Security!" she shrieked, her voice hoarse with rising panic. But her desperate command was instantly drowned out by the now familiar sound of Imani expertly connecting her secure cell phone to the ballroom's advanced sound system. The recorded voice of Richard Sterling suddenly filled the stunned space, casually discussing intricate money laundering techniques with the detached enthusiasm of a skilled craftsman describing his art. The key, of course, is all in the careful layering. His voice echoed ominously off the ornate gilded walls. By the time anyone tries to trace the actual ownership, the convoluted paper trail will simply lead directly to a discreet post office box in the Cayman Islands. As the carefully chosen recordings continued to play, meticulously painting a vivid picture of systematic criminal behavior that spanned several decades, the audience's initial confusion slowly transformed into something approaching genuine horror. These were their friends, their trusted business partners, their fellow pillars of the community, casually discussing serious crimes that would have easily sent ordinary citizens to federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. Victoria's shrill voice then joined the damning symphony of self-incrimination, laughing as she toasted their increasingly creative interpretations of complex tax law, while her assembled guests knowingly nodded along like eager conspirators at a highly confidential planning meeting. "Some of our more liquid assets," her pre-recorded voice, dripping with saccharine cheer, filled the ballroom. "We'll be taking an extended vacation in Switzerland." The unspoken punchline hung heavy in the air, at least until the SEC's unwelcome scrutiny faded away. The timing was brutally perfect. The context screamed guilt, and the implications for everyone in the room were nothing short of catastrophic. Imani stood tall at the podium, transformed into a seasoned prosecutor, delivering her closing statement. Her voice, a beacon of calm professionalism, systematically dismantled the decades-old facade of respectability that had shielded the Sterling family from accountability. "Over $200 million, she announced, each word echoing with righteous indignation, was stolen from charities meant to provide comfort to sick children, shelter to homeless families, and aid to victims of unimaginable disasters." Her voice resonated throughout the opulent ballroom, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers and carrying to the live television cameras broadcasting her every word across the city. Money donated by ordinary, hard-working citizens, who believed they were easing the suffering of others, was instead funneled into secret offshore accounts, used to finance extravagant lifestyles, yachts, mansions, and lavish parties, while children languished in underfunded hospitals, their futures stolen before they even had a chance. With a flick of her wrist, Imani commanded the room's projection screens to life. A series of financial charts and transaction records flashed before the audience, each document a damning indictment, another nail hammered into the coffin of Victoria Sterling's carefully curated public image. The chandeliers seemed to flicker nervously, as if the room itself recoiled from the sheer weight of the truth being unveiled. Suddenly, the ornate ballroom doors burst open, and a wave of FBI agents surged into the room, their badges gleaming under the crystal light, like hard-won medals of justice finally arriving to collect their due. Agent Sarah Chen, her voice sharp and decisive, cut through the stunned silence. "Victoria Sterling," she announced, her words leaving no room for doubt. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering, tax evasion, and fraud against charitable organizations." The soft clinking of jewelry was replaced by the cold snap of steel handcuffs. The sound of justice finally claiming its due. Victoria's perfectly applied makeup began to dissolve as tears streamed down her cheeks, the cameras capturing every excruciating moment of the millionaire's spectacular fall from grace. As the federal agents led her away, Victoria's carefully constructed composure shattered completely. The woman who had commanded respect through fear and intimidation was reduced to a pathetic figure, sobbing and pleading for mercy. "You don't understand," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the ballroom walls like the cry of a wounded animal. Her gaze fixated on Imani with a desperate, almost manic intensity. "I gave you a chance. I offered you money." Imani stood unmoved, her expression a mask of unwavering resolve, as she watched justice finally catch up with a woman who had believed herself untouchable for far too long. The same humiliation Victoria had so readily inflicted on others was now being returned to her tenfold. The audience, frozen in disbelief, began to stir. The sound of expensive heels clicking against the marble floors filled the room as guests, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and fear, began to file out, many already calculating their own potential exposure to the inevitable federal investigation that was sure to follow. Imani remained at the podium, surveying the wreckage of what had once seemed like an impenetrable fortress of wealth and privilege. The woman who had been dismissed as just another server had proven that knowledge was the ultimate equalizer, that the truth, when wielded with courage and conviction, could topple even the most formidable dynasty built on deceit. In the ensuing silence, the truth stood taller than any fortune, and justice finally had a face. 6 months after the Metropolitan Hotel Gala that had rocked the city to its core, the federal courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Reporters and spectators alike crowded into the courtroom, eager to witness the final act of the Sterling drama. Judge Margaret Thompson's gavel echoed through the packed room as she delivered sentences that would reshape the landscape of white-collar crime prosecution in America. "Victoria Sterling," the judge announced, her voice resonating with the weight of long-delayed justice. "You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. Richard Sterling," she continued, her gaze unwavering, "you are sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for your role as the architect of this criminal enterprise." The couple, who had once commanded respect through fear and intimidation, now sat in orange jumpsuits, their empire reduced to ashes, their future measured in decades behind bars. The forfeiture hearing that followed was equally devastating to the Sterling legacy. Federal prosecutors, working with relentless determination, had traced every stolen dollar through a labyrinth of offshore accounts and shell companies, recovering over $200 million in cash, property, and investments. These assets would be distributed to the charities and victims who had suffered under the Sterling's regime of greed. The Sterling mansion, their collection of luxury vehicles, and the yacht Victoria had audaciously named untouchable, were all seized by federal agents. The irony was not lost on anyone present. The very wealth they had used to corrupt officials and silence victims was now funding the justice system that had brought them down. Imani Rose stood on the courthouse steps, no longer the invisible waitress who had been dismissed and humiliated, but the courageous whistleblower whose actions had exposed decades of systemic corruption. The settlement check clutched in her briefcase represented $2 million in compensation for her lost wages and emotional distress. But more importantly, it represented validation, proof that her fight had been worth the immeasurable cost. Dorothy Rose's medical bills were now a distant memory. Her cancer treatment complete and successful, thanks to the financial security Imani had fought so hard to achieve. The machines that had once beeped out the rhythm of borrowed time now sat silent in hospital storage rooms, their work complete. The transformation in Imani's life was as dramatic as the fall of her former tormentors. Rose Financial Consulting occupied a gleaming office in the heart of downtown, its mission statement etched in gold letters on the lobby wall: empowering communities through financial justice. The firm specialized in helping minority-owned businesses navigate the complex world of corporate finance while providing pro bono services to families struggling with medical debt and predatory lending practices. Imani's team of analysts worked with the same precision that had brought down the Sterlings, but now their skills were used to build up rather than tear down. The waiting room was always full of aspiring entrepreneurs seeking guidance and community leaders planning economic development projects that would benefit entire neighborhoods. Lyjardin underwent its own dramatic transformation in the wake of the Sterling scandal. David Thompson's termination had been swift and permanent, his years of enabling discrimination finally catching up with him when federal investigators uncovered his role in perpetuating the restaurant's culture of prejudice. The new management had offered Imani a position as a financial consultant, tasked with ensuring that employee compensation and advancement opportunities were based on merit rather than social connections. The servers, who had once feared to speak out against injustice, now worked in an environment where their voices were heard and their contributions valued. The changes rippled through the entire hospitality industry as other establishments rushed to examine their own practices. Dorothy Rose's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous, her cancer retreating in the face of the best medical care money could buy. She spent her days volunteering at the community center, teaching literacy classes to adults who had been denied educational opportunities in their youth. My daughter showed this city that intelligence and determination matter more than birthright and bank accounts, Dorothy would proudly proclaim to anyone who would listen. She proved that justice isn't just a word in law books. It's something worth fighting for, no matter the cost. On a quiet Tuesday evening, Imani returned to Lyjardin, not as an employee or consultant, but as a customer, celebrating her mother's clean bill of health. She wore the same navy business suit from the night she had exposed the Sterling conspiracy. And in her purse, she carried the white napkin embroidered with Dr. Imani Rose, MBA. No longer a hidden reminder of her worth, but a trophy of a battle won against seemingly impossible odds. The server who brought their wine was a young black woman, whose confident posture and professional demeanor spoke of the opportunities that Imani's courage had unleashed. As mother and daughter raised their glasses in a toast to survival and justice, Imani reflected on the long and arduous journey that had brought them to this moment. The woman who had once feared for her mother's life now sat in the same dining room where Victoria Sterling had tried to break her spirit. But Victoria was gone, her influence vanquished. And in her place stood a new generation of leaders who understood that true power came from the courage to stand up for what was right.